So, I guess we can just make a couple introductions real quick because this is going to be on the recording. As last week, I'm Wolf McNally. I'm the designer and developer of Flying Logic. My kind of larger mission in life is to teach people to think better. And obviously, I'm Wolf McNally on Twitter. And this week, I got a blue check mark. Yay! So that's all I'll say for now. Michael, do you want to reintroduce yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Michael Guimarin, and I am interested in helping people navigate the modern information environment. So I'm excited today to talk about what that means, what sense-making is, how we use it to construct worlds that allow us to have great outcomes. Actually pretty stoked today.
I guess I will continue to invite people to speak until we have our speaker, in case they want to ask questions or whatever. So I'm going to invite Mr. Danger Casey here to speak. And that way we can just have a kind of open conversation going as well as we proceed. And then if we get more people, then we'll go with that. So, did you want to kind of make an opening set of remarks?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would say is when we talk about an information environment and when we talk about sense making, what we're talking about is something that exists before decision making. So when we have outcomes in our life, they tend to be the result of either active or passive decisions. And the context that surrounds us before we make those decisions is what I would call the information environment. And so if you are swimming in bad information, just as a consequence of having bad information, you're going to make suboptimal decisions, as opposed to if you had great information where you might be able to make better decisions. And I don't believe, as someone who studied cognitive psychology for a long time, I don't really believe that it's possible to improve your decision-making environment that much. But I do believe it's possible to construct a set of media so that you automatically make better decisions, right? And if you want to look at sort of what I mean by that in terms of the decision making, you can read Annie Duke's, book, Thinking in Bets, I think is what it is. And she talks a lot about how it's not really possible for us to make better decisions, but it is possible for us to make it harder to make bad decisions, right? So for example, the analogy in the kitchen is if you're trying to lose weight, you don't put donuts on the counter and then exercise willpower and not eating them. You just don't put donuts in your house at all.
Yeah, that's actually a practice I've mostly practiced successfully over the years, is just, wait until I'm going out with friends or whatever to eat junk food as opposed to bring it into my home.
Right, that's exactly right. And so the question that often comes up, so today's topic for me that I had prepared was, well, what are we supposed to do about, say, how are we supposed to understand like the war in Ukraine, or the gentleman who had what looks to be a heart attack in the NFL the other day, right? And because these are kind of like topical things, people want to have an opinion on them. So I was wondering if we should talk about that kind of stuff, Wolf, or if you wanted to talk about something else first.
No, I think that'd be very useful. I mean, personally, I've, there are particular sources, which of course I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on, that I've found to be valuable, at least in understanding things from a broader perspective. People like Peter Zeihan, when it comes to things like the Ukraine war and geopolitics in general, which is not a big area of expertise of mine. And I read his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, and found it to be very informative. But obviously, how we decide what's a good information source, I think, is something that is worth talking about, and relating them to these various kinds of current events, I think, is super important for people to hear.
Yeah,
I have a question.
What's that, Brian?
I have a question, which is, how can I determine how important any of these things are to me before I even decide if I need to know what is true and what is nonsense?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Brian. And it goes back to anytime that you're coming across something and you're thinking about, is this true or not, you need to ask, if I find out whether or not this is true, is it going to change a decision that I'm already making? So, for example, in my case, I'm less interested in the conspiracies around this gentleman in the NFL because I don't really watch the NFL and it doesn't affect any decisions that I'm already making. Whereas with the war in Ukraine, I am ostensibly voting for people. And so understanding the genesis of that war, why the US is at war, or however you want to think about it, that is really important to me. And so I would engage in a sense making exercise for, say, the war in Ukraine, because I was able to answer that question. You know, if finding out this is true or not, would it change a decision I'm already making? Maybe it turns out it's a just war. And so the person that I'm voting for who is anti war is maybe the wrong person to be voting for, right? And then that gets into a larger conversation about mission, which is that a lot of people want to want someone to say, "Oh, you should follow this source because it's really good," or "Follow that source because it's really good," because they don't really want to make decisions or be responsible for their own information, and that is because they are typically it's because they're lost in what their mission is, right? So if you say like, okay, my mission is to do X, then you can even short circuit the war in Ukraine question, which is, does figuring this out support or detract from my mission, right? And does figuring this out cause me to change a behavior that I'm already taking, right? So this is even before deciding to engage in an active sense making conversation. And I think this is what people get very frustrated with when they speak to me about their information environment, because I always return it to, well, what is it that you're trying to accomplish in your own life? What's your priority? And how are you being disciplined and consistent and executing towards that priority, that mission every single day? And if you're not clear on that, then me teaching you that such and such a source is a front for the US intelligence community or a front for the Russian intelligence community, or, you know, their business interests are like this, that's actually ultimately not going to be helpful because you're not pursuing what it is that you want to be doing. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yes.
I think there's a lot of people who feel like they're informed. They watch the news and so on, and they're kind of being told what to think. And you know, they kind of see it as a form of entertainment, and because it's low effort on their mind just to believe what they're being told. And it seems to me that what we're aiming this kind of thoughts at is people who actually see it as a way of figuring out how they need to act in the world. I mean, how does the Ukraine war affect me personally? How does it, you know, obviously, probably the most obvious way is maybe at the pump, but you know, uh, how do we, you know, how do you make these things that seem very kind of high and out there and abstract that people often want for entertainment these days, you know, more real to them? That's the big question that I want to know. Or
Yeah,
good
well,
answers to.
yeah. So there's a couple of things here. The first thing is that 90% of people are consumers. And so they're really just going to consume whatever information that they're given. And then they'll be surprised when they don't have good outcomes in their life. So they'll be upset that they're overweight, and they'll be like frustrated that they followed all the diet advice, that they've done the things that they were told to do, but because they've never decided to make an active choice to say, okay, the outcomes that I'm getting are not what I want. How can I get better outcomes? And then to take responsibility for that, right? That is the first and most important thing. And already 90% of people don't do it. So we have to set that aside, right? Those people who are entertained by being told what to think, right? And ask ourselves, like, okay, I need to focus on how I'm thinking and how I'm constructing my information and media sources so that I do get information that I can best utilize to achieve, again, what it is that I want to achieve. And it's fine to consume junk information for media purposes if that's your intent. But I think a lot of people have this false belief that because they follow media that's within their tribe, and it conforms to their understanding of their own reality, that they're somehow doing really well. And I would say that to the extent that the outcomes that you're getting from doing that are aligned with what you want to happen in your life, then I would say it's a good information environment. But if the outcomes that you're getting are not aligned with what you want to be doing in your life, then you have a much deeper problem, because now you are having to take responsibility for how you are processing this information and not just what information is coming down the pipe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of also raises the question that I think a lot of people don't consider very much, which is what do they want to be doing with their life? Because if you don't answer that question, then you're kind of drifting. I mean, Napoleon Hill talked about the difference between drifters and people who have definiteness of purpose. If you have definiteness of purpose, then it seems to me you can construct your information environment in such a way that facilitates that. If you're just drifting through life, then you just consume whatever happens to present itself and you don't care, but they, of course, you end up being a useful idiot for other people. So it seems to me that we're speaking to people who want to or have definiteness of purpose or feel like they ought to have that. But it seems to me that until you define that kind of goal structure in your life, what you're really trying to achieve, knowing how to construct what kind of information to consume or think about or base your or sense make with to base your actions on, is kind of secondary to that. You got to know your goal first.
Right. Yeah. And this is why I think it's such a difficult place to operate in, because most people don't have those rites of initiation into adulthood. And so they don't, take responsibility for themselves or for their society or whatever. And they don't answer these questions for themselves, like, well, what is it that I'm actually doing? Why am I spending all of this time, watching CNN? And then the problem is that we are so good at persuasion now. Some people are, right? And you could think of Facebook and Google and the large tech companies, because it's an easy target, as being optimized for getting people engaged in their content. So you have these people that are paid $500,000 a year to get people addicted to consuming Facebook content, right? They're very, very smart at what they do. And if you're just passively consuming information against people who are very good at what they're doing, which is persuading, you really run the risk of being entrained. Now, what does it mean to be entrained? So if you go to the traditional definition is if you go to a music concert and people start clapping and everyone starts clapping in unison, that's an example of entrainment. And it's where we sort of sacrifice our individual will to the collective decision-making process. And if you look at the structure of communication in a lot of modern media, it is designed to first overload your system and second to imprint specific patterns, right? There was a joke on 4chan for many years that CNN was negative story, negative story, negative story, positive story, commercial break, right? And they have taken that to an extreme with the laugh tracks on the late night television comedy shows, where if you go and you watch like The Daily Show, especially more recently, you can see that the hosts will say absurd statements without a lot of evidence, and then there'll be a laugh track, and then they'll just jump into the next thing. And so you're overriding people's ability to process the information that they're taking, and it's creating an army of the entrained. And what's crazy from my perspective is there's a director now who is a writer then of the movie 28 Days Later, which is a movie about zombies. You could say is sort of the genesis of all the modern zombie movies. And at the beginning of the movie, Alex Garland writes this scene where the monkeys are watching television, and the television is making them crazier and crazier and crazier until they basically become this sort of like feral entity that, when released, they turn everyone into zombies. And I can't help but wonder, here we have an artist who is maybe trying to tell us something about the media that we consume, turning us into somebody who's not able to pay attention and really make effective decisions. And of course, it's tribal, right? So it's not like there's one I think a lot of people make a mistake and they say, oh, there's like one group of people that are running the world or whatever. That's not really right. It's sort of like we're all trying to persuade all of ourselves, and so we all are creating this kind of media pattern. And it's just that because the internet allows for infinite information for free, it's just 10 times worse. And so I do think that the first thing, like you said, Wolf, is when you decide, okay, my mission in life is that I want to help people by doing X, Y, or Z, right? Or, I want to be a great farmer. That understanding of what your mission is allows you to filter out everything else and say, okay, is understanding whether, the media portrayal of the war in Ukraine, is that effective for me? Right. And like one of the other challenges with this, and I don't really know how to explain this to people, is that, when Donald Trump was tweeting, when he was on Twitter, he was tweeting for at times one person, but to an audience of the entire world. And so it's never really been the case where you could be in the room without being in the room. So you're seeing all of these people communicate to one person, but to millions. And that is extremely overwhelming because you're like, okay, we see this thing, but we can't do anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, I see that, when Elon Musk, tweets or whatever, millions of people see it, and a lot of people respond. And of course, he'll probably see almost none of those responses, one or two of them, if any. And at the same time, we feel like we have this kind of intimate parasocial relationship with Elon Musk now on Twitter, because, he tweets fairly often, and sometimes he's just responding interesting to various people, So how we manage these kinds of parasocial relationships, that are facilitated by the internet, I think is also super important because, we start to feel intimate with people that we're not intimate with, who have never heard of us. And this is a new phenomenon. This is not something that people had to deal with before. And I think it could be good in some ways, but I think it can be really terrible in others because, we're giving a lot of people a lot of influence over us.
Well, it also depends on our tribal boundaries now. When it was, if my parent says it's true, which was the appropriate belief of most 6-year-olds, that's great. Maybe your extended relative at the family gathering is a little bit less reliable, but we knew who to generally believe. But if I like most of what I see Elon Musk write on Twitter, does that mean he's in my tribe or that I'm in his tribe?
Yeah, that's very complicated. I would say that there's a lot of research in this phenomena in psychology for people who have formed relationship with imaginary characters. So in psychology, we would say these would be people who are on the autism spectrum, where they get really excited about a particular character and they form a parasocial relationship with them. So you might, we've seen this for 50 years where people feel like they know the actor that they see on screen, right? And that phenomena of like how, musicians are able to become so popular because they allow people to feel something emotionally. So this is not necessarily a new phenomena. It's just that it's a phenomena that is much bigger. And so we have to ask those questions, right? Like, there's 7,500 people that follow me on Twitter. I don't know 7,450 of them, right? And so if we're able to meet up in person and they'll be like, hey, Michael, it's so great to meet you. They'll have this constructed idea of who I am, and I don't know who they are. And it's very uncomfortable on both sides in those situations. And I can't imagine what it's like for people that have millions of followers or fans, right? And you hear all these famous people be like, I feel so alone, and yet they're communicating with all these people. And so you're right, Wolf. It is something that's very challenging. And I do want to get back to, okay, you've decided that you have a mission, and now you've decided that whatever the topic is worthy of running a sense-making activity on. So just to be clear to everybody who's joined in the last few minutes, when you come across a piece of information, the first question to ask is figuring out whether or not this piece of information is true going to help me with my mission, or it's going to change a decision that I'm already making? If the answer to those questions is not yes, like a strong yes, you should not spend a ton of time trying to figure out whether or not it's true. You should spend that time instead towards achieving your mission, or doing something else, right? And we have this fear of missing out with a lot of things, which is sort of hardwired from like what Brian said, from our evolutionary past where information was scarce. You know, your grandparents, great grandparents, they maybe only got, I don't know, a few hundred people they would have met in their entire lifetime. And now I get a few hundred people in my Twitter feed before 9 a.m. And so this fear of missing out scarcity trick that we have is not good, right? And so you really need to be very crystal clear at the top. But assuming that you've made that decision, okay, this is aligned with my mission, and figuring out whether this is true is going to change a decision that I'm already making. Then the next question is, what do you do after that? Is that is that a good signpost,
Yeah,
Wolf,
this
or
is
you
something
want to
I've,
let people
yeah,
come up?
yeah, no, yeah, I want you to continue in this vein. I just want to throw in that, um, I've often called this choosing your ignorance, because ignorance is something, is a state we start out in, but it's also knowing that you're ignorant about something, and choosing to stay ignorant is a way of preserving your life energy for other things, and of course knowing your mission, knowing what those other things are, is super important. It's a big discriminator, because then you can decide, oh, that's super interesting, that shiny thing over there. I'm not going to deal with it. I'm not going to learn about it. I'm not going to, because it won't make a difference. It would therefore count as entertainment, not anything that is actually going to affect my life or my mission in any constructive way. And so becoming more mindful of that and choosing to become ignorant of more things, or stay ignorant of things in a very conscious way, I think is super important for people to learn. So it sounds like that's kind of the path you're headed down on. And I would like to hear kind of, your kind of framework for thinking about, okay, this is going to change, this could change my mind about something. Either how do you decide that whether something is in line with your mission, or once you decide it is, how do you kind of avoid kind of creeping into things that don't? How do you avoid going down rabbit holes that end up not being fruitful towards that end?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of, well, so the first thing is that most of the tricks, if you will, come from finance, because in finance, you either made a good decision or a bad decision, right? And you can say, and sort of the goal is you want to focus on your process. So a good process leads to good outcomes. Good outcomes don't necessarily mean a good process. And I think that from Charlie Munger or Graham. So it's not like a Benjamin Graham. It's not like a new thing. And then
I
that
think
concept.
I think Scott Adams also says, systems not goals kind of idea. Is that in line with that?
Yes, exactly. It's very similar. The other thing is like this concept of I want to be selectively ignorant about topics. In finance, you might say that it's outside of your circle of competence, right? So you might say, I'm really, so like for me, Michael, I'm very good at private tech companies, understanding them, understanding the financing environment behind them, et cetera, et cetera. I am terrible at macro commodities, terrible, absolutely terrible. And every time that I go in to try and make a macro play in commodities or something like that, I get absolutely wrecked and I lose money. And so the market is teaching me this lesson over and over and over again, which is stay in your lane, right? And in finance, it's easier to learn that lesson because you lose all your money if you don't stay in your circle of competence.
It's very
And
concrete.
it's very concrete, right? And whereas in sort of the environment, people are like, "Hey, did you hear about that guy? Blah blah blah," or like, "What do you think about Ukraine?" Right? It's like, well, do I need to have an opinion about this? It's a lot.
Right.
It takes a lot more energy to say, okay, I don't need to have an opinion about this, and I think that's number one. But to get back to your point of, what mental models do we use once we decide that something is worthy of our attention? Um, the things that I'm always trying to look for are, again, is to orient myself in the topic in that novice, intermediate, and expert realm, right? So in any topic, like let's say the war in Ukraine, there's going to be what information, right? So there's going to be some basic facts that are going to help us to understand the current reality. Then there's going to be like when and how information, which is like when are those facts or rules violated, and then people are going to finally get to the expert level, which is why. And so when I'm first trying to learn about a topic, I'm just trying to learn about the what of that, right? What are the heuristics that play into that? And so one of the things I found very frustrating about the war in Ukraine is that when I was looking at our media about it, there was no discussion. Like I grew up and I watched the McLaughlin group, okay, and they debated things. There was
Right.
no discussion that said this is why Putin is invading Ukraine. There was nothing. It was just like he's really evil. Um, there were no facts around why he was doing it. It was just statements like he's really evil or whatever. And it was very frustrating for me because I like to say, okay, I should be able to argue both sides in something. And a war is really serious. People are going to die, etc. And they're going to ask me to make voting right. And in theory, when the U.S. government sends weapons abroad, they're doing it with my consent. So it was very serious for me to be like, okay, how do I understand this? And there was no discussion. There was no discussion about why Russia would do this. And for me, whenever I come into a topic and only one side's set of facts is presented, but not the other side, it's an immediate tip off that information environment is heavily tilted towards making a very particular set of results. Now, I don't know anything. I mean, that's not fair. I've been studying Mearsheimer and real politics for a long time, but I would say that I don't know anything about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and it goes back centuries, right? And so when I see our media immediately say, this war started in 2022 and it was because of this unnecessary hostile aggression, to me that was a tip off. So that's the first thing is, what are the basic facts and are they being delivered in a way that allows me to derive my own conclusion about what is happening? And if not, then that's a tip off that it's a bad media environment. That's
It's
step
part of
one.
the my own acknowledgement of my ignorance about a lot of geopolitical things and so on that drove me to find people like Peter Zeihan, who I'm not saying he's right. I think he has some great ideas and he's definitely worth following. It's Zeihan in case anybody wants to look him up. Zeihan on Geopolitics is his channel. But he talks about how this is actually an existential thing for Russia. It has to do with both access to ports as well as the encroachment of NATO and things like that. And these are all things that I would be completely ignorant of if it weren't for him pointing these things out. So he does talk about a lot of the why of these things, and he doesn't make a lot of predictions about exactly how things will go, but he does actually say these are the trends. Particularly when it comes to things like demographics and so on, because he's about demographics and geography and how they play into what's going on in the world geopolitically. And what he says is actually just totally unlike anything I hear in the regular media. And so it's like, if for no other reason, I think that seeking out opinions like that are obviously informed, even if they're biased, is still very useful to my own making sense of the world. I'm curious what you think of the general approach.
I think it's very dangerous
Okay, well, let me
because,
know.
yeah, I think it's very dangerous because if you want to sell someone a lie, you have to make it very specific.
Okay.
Right. So that's why if you watch like Star Trek or science fiction, they're always like, the phase modulator is off by 0.3 microns.
Okay.
It's a very common trope in science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very wary of, first of all, life is super fractal. And so what you see really, it really changes on how close you are to the topic, right? You might call it skin in the game if it's a financial investment or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And if I am not an expert in something and it's not in my circle of competence, I really want to stay on like what is happening, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and not like, oh, well, it's because of this or like that, or so and so sees it like this. I cannot tell you with this particular example with Ukraine how, because I try to keep a track, right? Like I've been inspired by others to try and write things down and then see how I'm doing. I
Mm-hmm.
have made so many mistakes about what I thought was happening when I thought it was happening, that I just give up, right? And I fall back to my position, which is just, we shouldn't be in wars because everybody is a loser, and we shouldn't be pushing for war because it just makes everybody a loser, right? But like, yeah, it's not my experience when I'm not an expert in something that I'm able to, how like everyone does this thing on the internet where they become an expert in a topic in 15 minutes by reading sort of talking points, and then they think that because they've read opposing talking points that they're able to take a side. I think this is very dangerous, and I think it's very dangerous for, it's one thing to do it on like a football game. It's something else entirely to do it when you go to your doctor, right? So like we've all had the experience where we know more about whatever our ailment is than our doctor, but we don't have the experience of the doctor to contextualize the information that we have. And so we can still end up drawing the wrong conclusion. And there's many examples of that. And then for something as complicated as geopolitics, um, yeah, it's like so often you just really don't know, and you have
So
to wait.
are you saying that you shouldn't seek out various kinds of opinions or thoughts? I mean, for example, one of the reasons I like Zion is he's not saying taking a side in, for example, between Russia and Ukraine. He's basically saying here's the situation. He understands it. Here's the intelligence that he's aware of. Here's the history and the kind of the geopolitical structure around the demographics and geography of the area and so on. And
Yeah.
and are you saying that it's dangerous? Because I'm not saying that I would form a positive, strong opinion about it based on what he's saying. I feel like generally I'm more informed than an average person because I'm listening to such things. But is that what you're calling dangerous? I'm curious.
Well, I think there's a danger in taking the precision and drawing a conclusion from it and feeling like you've drawn the right conclusion.
Yeah, I'm not drawing conclusions personally. I don't think
Okay.
Peter Zeihan is either. I think that's one of the reasons why I admire him
Okay.
I think he's
Then
happy.
I'm mistaken, Wolf, and I apologize.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I just feel like, because I think that, yeah, in situations that are complex like that, anybody who draws hard and fast conclusions, I think, is probably mistaken on many levels. But in general, when I think about constructing my information environment, I want to listen to people who are obviously have, well, for example, Peter Zeihan gets hired by companies to help them predict the future. So his investment is in terms of, where they should place manufacturing and things like that. Uh, if he were just a political mouthpiece, then he'd be so biased as to be useless because that's not what these companies want. That's not why they hire him.
Yeah, so I want to
So
generalize that pattern for people. So basically what Wolf was talking about, which I think is very good as well, is I try to think of my sources in a network topology. So if you think about like a graph with edges and nodes, and what you're trying to do is figure out what the bias is for a source. And the best thing is when a source maintains the same bias over a long period of time. So, for example, as long as I've been reading The Economist, it's anti Israeli and pro Palestinian. So, any article that I read about that periodical, about that conflict in that periodical, I can almost guarantee you that's exactly what it's going to be framed in terms of. That is really helpful in me in determining new information because what I can do is I can integrate a new piece of information with that understanding of the bias of the source in mind. And so, like what Wolf's talking about with Zion, sounds like, is that he is called upon by people who want to make money. And so his advice tends to be slanted in, from a financial point of view. Is
yeah, I
that
mean, well, he also, I think he consults the U.S. government as well, but primarily, basically, if you watch his channel, he's basically, coming to, unless he's out in the mountains hiking and live blogging from there, he's basically in some place where he's obviously in some kind of major Western, city or whatever, where he's obviously meeting people for his consulting gigs, and these are, oftentimes companies or whatever who they're concerned about, trends in, he's not an anti-globalist, for instance, but he's also feels like the world is deglobalizing,
okay?
and things like that. So he doesn't say globalism is good as bad. He says here's the history. Here's what's going on right now. Here are the trends.
Got
And
it.
so if you want to, like, for example, like, the coming demographic collapse in China, and pointing out how different countries have different demographic structures that mean that they're either aging very rapidly, that their workforce is going to drop rapidly in the next 5-10 years, things like that. And I think that's just enormously useful information that he puts into good, useful context if you care about geopolitics at all. So, but yeah, he's not. He admits he has biases, but he also points out that that's not what people pay him for.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
So then generalizing, when you're looking at a source, you want to understand over time what that source's biases are, and then look at how they respond to novel events in a field of area that you're studying, right? So I might collect, and how do I collect a source? Well, a source might be somebody who gives me the proper level of information for where I'm at. So if I'm a novice, then I want to know what's happening. If I'm an intermediate, then I want to know when and how the rules of the novice are being violated. And if I'm an expert in a topic, I want to understand, what and why things are changing, right? So you construct your environment by looking at your sources and orienting yourself towards them. And then something very fascinating happens, and you have to be studious, which appeals to me, which is sometimes they won't talk about a story that you expected that they would. And in psychology, that's called the dog that isn't barking. And that to me has been the biggest way to actually understand the bias of a source, or all of a sudden they defect from a particular way of thinking about a topic, even though they're in the same area as a bunch of other people who have not defected.
What would
And
be like a concrete example of the dog that isn't barking that you've noticed kind of lately in the, I mean, can you make that more concrete?
well, so um, there's one that I always use is really obvious, but it's outing an intelligence agency, so I just maybe shouldn't use that one. But
I was thinking of things like, for example, the Biden laptop story being suppressed during the election and things like that. That basically,
okay, I'll tell you
nobody's
one.
talking about
I'll
it,
tell
but
you one.
but
Okay,
but everybody who's actually paying attention is talking about it. But they're saying, no, look over here.
Yeah, okay, I'll tell you about it. So there was a Twitter thread by the guy who does Do Not Pay, okay?
Okay.
And he was talking about how Warren Buffett invited him as a college student, and how it was this amazing experience and blah blah blah, and Do Not Pay changed, and he got to have this conversation with Warren Buffett in front of the 120 CEOs that rule the Fortune 500 or whatever, however he was framing it. So the
Hmm.
dog that wasn't barking is, why was he in the room in the first place, and does that have anything to do with the success that he was having, right? And
Right.
like the whole, once you're like, wait a minute, what were you doing here? Like for me, it just changed the entire tenor of that entire argument, that he was trying to put something out, right? Or like um, Sam Bankman Fried. He
Right.
No, I mean, he says, I'm an ethical altruist. His parents are ethics professors, right? Like it's kind of strange that if you focus so much on ethics, actually, that's a me that doth protesteth too much. But nevertheless, like, there's examples of these cognitive bias. Like, if someone's always talking about being ethical, for me, it's kind of like, maybe that person's not ethical.
Yeah.
Right. And so, in
I'm
the
not
dog that
lying this
isn't,
time.
yeah, exactly. Right. And I think when you're looking at a source, trying to figure out when they don't talk about subjects, I think is very, very helpful. But again, you have to be watching them for a long time. Um, and you also have to balance that with, people tend to tell you who they are right up front. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, the traditional, manifestation of this has been what's been called in journalism bearing the lead, LEDE. Basically when, the real substance, the real important thing isn't in the headline. It's like 5 paragraphs down, but they don't want to be accused of not saying it, so they still say it, but they say it very quietly. And finding these buried leads, I think, is super important to understanding the biases of your sources. Is what are they saying because they are saying it through gritted teeth, and what are they saying because it really kind of serves their narrative.
Yeah, well, and I mean, there's that whole other thing about media. Okay, so to review, um, information environments are upstream of your decision making. It's probably not possible to get better at decision making as a process because of all the cognitive biases that people suffer from. And so, by pruning our information environment, by being really clear about what we consume and why we're consuming it, we can lead to better outcomes. And one way to do that is to frame everything for, is this helping me achieve my mission or goal? And then when we're looking at a source, to try and figure out what their bias is, whether it's financial or geographic, political, etc., and then orienting ourselves to that bias through time. That is sort of a very quick summary of where we've been. And I understand that we have 20 minutes left, and I would like to
Yep.
open it up for questions if anyone from the audience has a question. So if you have
Yeah,
a
I was going to
question, just
suggest
raise
that.
your hand, and Wolf and I will see it, and we'll bring you up to answer it. But yeah, I think that's sort of like, what is an information environment? We got that. How do you think about constructing it? We got that. Filter it through your mission, and then, okay, let's get down into sources and biases. And I apologize for people that I'm not just like, hey, you should, follow Zero Hedge. They're really great. They were great during the whatever COVID situation, so they're always going to be great going forward. I think this is very bad way to do sense making and setting up your information environment. And so even though you'll see me follow Zero Hedge and retweet things that they say, that doesn't mean that like that's the source that you should use, right? And I think one
Yeah.
of our problems is, we're always like, okay, there was this experience, at least for me as a millennial, where my parents could read the Wall Street Journal every day and basically be informed on what was going on. And people want to repeat that today. They're like, okay, well, what is it that I just need to read every day so that I'm not going to get bamboozled? And it's like, well, it doesn't really work like that anymore, because everybody has an agenda that they're pushing, and there's sort of a bad shelling point for media where there's no such thing as objective news. There never was, but now we actually see it. And so you really have to be much more responsible for your own outcomes, which unfortunately, because we only have so much time, greatly limits the number of things that we can speak on authoritatively, as opposed to before, where we could speak on a lot of topics authoritatively because everyone shared the same media sources. Now we don't. And so you really have to be, like an expert in like one really small thing. And for everything else, you're like, you know what, that doesn't affect me. So I'm going to be selectively ignorant. All right.
Yeah, I, I think that's a really super important framework. I I don't want to sound like a Peter Zeihan fanboy either, because I'm not. I have been listening to his stuff. I found it very informative, but I listen to dozens of sources, and I weigh them all kind of against each other, and I don't agree with everything anybody says. So I feel like taking personal responsibility to make up your own mind about things, and kind of drink from many waters, I think is one of the most important things I wish people would do more of. But people often find themselves, they're either committed to Alex Jones or committed to Tim Pool or committed to, name your YouTuber or celebrity, and once they're committed that way, then they give up the ability to think for themselves. I think that's one of the biggest things I would change about the world if I could right now is it's like the Monty Python sketch. You're all unique individuals. We are all unique individuals. So yeah. So if anybody else would like to speak, ask questions, give thoughts, or whatever,
Let's do it.
Yeah, please join us.
Yeah. Hey. I just wanted to chip in my 2 cents about constructing like a information environment, and
Go ahead.
what's been working really good for me, in addition to what you just mentioned, by finding different types of sources for different types of areas of interest, is to I've been so lucky that I've found, in addition to your Discord, I've found other Discord channels which focus on different areas, which collects a good bunch of different type of people, and in these type of environments that are a little bit more intimate than, for instance, Twitter, you start to get to know people, and you can test ideas and see how people react and get actual resistance to your opinions, and in that way you can pry and get a feel for how well formulated are your ideas.
Yeah, I think being willing to be challenged on your ideas and preconceptions is kind of a fundamental skill that a lot of people don't learn. Just being willing to hear what other people say, and just kind of momentarily step outside yourself and think, well, what if they're right and I'm not? And then kind of explore that with an open mind, and being free to come back to where you were at the start. If you feel like, yeah, well, I've tested the idea, it doesn't really pan out. But rather than just reject it something on ideological grounds, is really kind of think about, why do I believe what I believe, and is it well founded, and how can I improve it? So I think that's very important.
Yeah, I would say 2 things
Michael?
as well, which is, number one is, it seems like people have 2 critical points in communication with others. One is the 2 pizza rule. So about 7 or 8 people is about the maximum size that you can have a team that's working on a goal together. And then there's Dunbar's number, which is around 150 people, which is basically the largest size of a mafia that you can run before you need to sort of federate it. And so what Dead, forgive me for not knowing your name, but you're using a pseudonym, what Deadhedge was talking about of you have a reputation among a small group of people is going to be underneath that Dunbar's number, where there is status in the group for pursuing the values of the group along a particular vertical. But like if you're in, say, a group of 20,000 people, it's going to have a completely different dynamic, and you're not going to have that intimacy. So I'm just trying to give people a heads up, and this is partially why, the dynamics on Twitter, where in theory it's everyone, are altogether different again. So if you're thinking about joining a small sense-making group, the best size is 7 to 8 people. And then everything over about 150 is going to be very, very challenged. So that's
How would that relate to the kind of the mastermind concept, the idea that you get together with a small group of people who are interested in improving themselves in various ways, and then you kind of, play off each other over time? Do you think that there's that we should have things like, sense-making masterminds?
I do. So
small
I
groups?
actually designed basically how to do sense making with 8 people. So after we were able to make so much money from the COVID situation by just paying attention to people, I worked with a number of capital allocators, and I don't want to say it was just sort of forwarding what Adam Townsend wrote or what Loki wrote or what Cernovich wrote, but being able to identify trends before they were happening was so valuable that I was like, okay, how can we teach people to do this, and what's the appropriate group size? And I think a mastermind for sense making, I think ultimately that's where it goes to. Which, when you think about it, whether you're in a platoon or you're in a church group or whatever, it always seems to fall down to 4 to 8 guys in a room trying to figure out what's going on. You look at like private equity entities, they're like that size. They don't really get bigger than that. Same with and VC, of course, is a subset of private equity. It seems like men who are trying to figure out what's going on, they tend to be in that 4 to 8 person group size. And then when you go above that, now all of a sudden there's all kinds of vying for status that happens, as opposed to we are working as a single solitary team, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Like a kind of a SEAL unit or something like that. With a mission and different kind of experiences and specialties. But or an A team is another way of putting it. But so and how do you land at that 7, 8 number? I mean, is it just through experience?
No, it's
or
like
is
all
there,
of human history.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like all of human history. Everything important happens with a with a team of 4 to 8 people. Right? Like you're going to go and you're going to hunt the buffalo. How big is that team? It's 4 to 8 people, right? If you look at all the Silicon Valley innovation companies that do real,
like Google,
yeah, right?
They started
exactly.
that small.
And if you think about the way you and I met, Wolf, that organization that we're in, the size of that conference is only 150 people or so, right? Every single year. I mean, like humans do tend to, and when we do BOFs, it's 4 to 8 people. Like this is very well studied phenomena among men who are tackling uncertainty, right? Like in the military, every military on earth, the smallest unit is not the individual soldier, it's the platoon, and it's 4 to 8 people.
Right.
So, yeah.
I've always said that your family is whoever have your back and who know that you have theirs. So and you can't know that with a large number of people, because and I also say that conspiracies happen, but they have to stay small, because the larger they get, the less stable they are.
There's
the more the more you have conflicting missions coming in, things like that. And
you have to consider Metcalfe's law for people that are listening to this, which is that the number of communication channels squares with the number of people in the group. And so you really can't, this is why, like, I think there's a lot of reasons why it's 4 to 8 people, but it's basically 4 to 8 people. Look at Jeff Bezos, right? He's like, it's a 2 pizza team, anyway. So,
yeah, I think that's a great principle. And it kind of suggests that there's a lot of room to popularize this idea and get the idea out that people should be engaging in professional masterminds or sense-making masterminds, kind of the thing where they're finding people who don't necessarily think like they do. In fact, they're better if they're more diverse thinkers, but able to have civil conversations about it and reach better conclusions together as kind of a platoon.
Yes. Well, I mean, like even in sales, so my career started in engineering. So I learned a lot of things in engineering in small groups. And then in sales, one of the first things I did was set up like a lead sharing thing where we had breakfast once a week. And I know that sounds really old school, but it worked for me. And it was a group of 4 to 8 guys, and we would share leads. And, it was like one guy was a real estate guy, one guy was a lawyer, one guy was, selling insurance. And you just create those little groups. And I think that is the correct way to do it as a group. And then each person can specialize. So there's going to be that person who's really good with, medical information. There's going to be that person that's really good with, figuring out finances and whatnot. And so you can have that situation. And then because it's a smallish group, then you're going to have success. All right. So any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, if anybody else wants to request to speak, now's a great time. I also want to just give us a chance to kind of, pitch where we are. Again, I'm Wolf McNally. You can find me at flyonlogic.com. If you want to join my Discord, it's chat.flyonlogic.com. I also have youtube.com/Beware of Wolf podcast. So if you just search for Beware of Wolf, you may or may not find me. I'm not big yet, but Beware of Wolf podcast, you will find me. And I a lot of what I go into there is about teaching people, especially young people, but everybody, how to think better. So yeah, Michael, do you want to tell people where you can be found?
Yeah, so I'm Michael Guimarin at Michael Guimarin on Twitter. I've also done a podcast, the Info Diet podcast. I really want to teach this information that I have struggled very hard to come up with. I used to teach a class. It was very expensive for me, and so I might teach it again, but it's going to be very expensive. So I think yeah, and it's really hard because you're also like recapitulating everything that's written in the Bible, right? And this is like a really difficult thing. Well, because everything that's old is new again. I'm also like at that age in my life where I'm discovering that everything that I think is an interesting thing has been said like 500 years prior, if not said by like all the people that I read in my classics degree. So like Ptolemy and Euripides and Thucydides and Plato and all these people. You're like, okay, great. So I'm saying something that's freaking 3,000 years old.
Right. It's like the Simpsons already did.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like,
right. So
it's
you
like,
feel like,
yeah, this is a great idea. Yeah, Socrates already
yeah,
said
exactly. And like their argument is so much better than you could ever hope to articulate. And so then I'm like, well, should I just spend the rest of my life just summarizing what they say for people and passing it off as myself, and then sort of
honestly, a big part of my personal mission is to become kind of the Carl Sagan of better thinking, and so and yeah, I didn't invent better thinking, it's been out there forever, and yet people aren't learning it. So how do you make that, how do you make critical thinking sexy again?
exactly.
That's the question I keep asking myself every
Yeah.
day.
So if anybody in the audience has thoughts on how I can teach more people about these concepts around how to organize your information environment to get better results, like I really don't believe, like, for example, I'll give you an example. There's something called HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. So if you have a person and you make them hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, they're not going to make good decisions. It doesn't matter how smart they are, right? You can look at you can train them to memorize things and increase their working capacity and teach them all the mental models. But if they are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, it's going to be terrible, right? And you can see this with children. If anybody who has children, it's like that's the first thing you do is try to do that, or with a spouse, right? And if most people would just understand that they're more likely to be emotionally triggered when they're under a HALT condition, that would already be a really big thing, right? Or we have these
does this get used in certain ways as a way of disarming people, of getting them to make bad decisions?
Absolutely. And it's not bad decisions, it's just decisions that may or may not be associated with their best interests, right? And the thing that I find really great about the internet is that it's really shrinking the size of the world, right? So globalization made the world really small in a certain sense, but really big in another sense. And the internet is making it so that these asymmetric power relationships are going away. So people prefer accountability at a more coach level, as opposed to like if the FDA says that a drug is safe, like what are you supposed to do as an individual? You can't really do anything about that. You can't really opt out of the US IRS because you don't like, whatever policy that we have, foreign. Right. And so like, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to get stuff on a total tangent, but something I sparked on just now is, I have a few friends who have gone down rabbit holes like, QAnon or, chemtrails or whatever, conspiracy theories or, 12-strand DNA woo stuff. And I feel like the one thread I can draw between them all is they're lonely, or they felt like they have like not achieved a major life purpose, or maybe don't have one.
Okay, wait.
And so they tend to
Can
get
I just cut you off right there and give people the
yeah.
best piece of advice that I was ever given by my grandmother, who was an expert in international relations. She
Okay.
said to me something which I will never forget, which you should all write down if you care about this at all, which is that reality as it's presented is only one adjacency away from reality as it exists.
Okay,
So if
interesting.
you are considering whether or not something is a conspiracy theory, people do not lie multiple divisions away from actual reality. So when they tell you something, it's either true if they tell it to you enough, or it's only one adjacency away from what's going on. Right? And so like what you'll frequently see is you'll see like, okay, this person has brought up some really good questions about, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, right? Right. It was reported that there was a ship that was attacked twice. It wasn't. The U.S. then decided to go to war in Vietnam, and so they'll say the Gulf of Tonkin incident was wrong, and the government confused people into starting the war in Vietnam. That's true, right? Definitively true, right? Where they go wrong is they'll go, okay, but the Gulf of Tonkin incident itself was really run by a small group of people in the intelligence community. You're like, okay. And that small group of people in the intelligence community was really taking their marching orders from the international bankers through the Federal Reserve. And see, the Federal Reserve itself is run by people that own Federal Reserve notes, which at the end of the day is the Rothschilds, and there are reptile people living in pyramids in Antarctica, right? And the problem is that
that was a beautifully constructed sequence there,
I
by
try,
the way,
I try, Wolf. The problem is that the first observation, which is that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a false flag, is true. And so the moment that the government says, no, this happened, and then you learn, what was that? Lusitania had weapons on it. We learned in 2008, okay, and it was like denied by the British government for whatever 90 years prior to that. So the moment that you learn that the first thing is true when you were lied to in a big way, or WMD in Iraq, okay, there were no WMD in Iraq, I'm sorry, they never found it. Then all of a sudden, you're primed to fall down these infinite rabbit holes, right? And you come out on the other end believing some insane things. And the question is, where do you...
In Wonderland.
Exactly. Where do you get off the ride? And my grandmother always told me, she said, it's only one adjacency from reality, right? And so if you're going multiple adjacencies, you find yourself falling down this rabbit hole of multiple adjacencies. It's usually a good example that you're not correct. And the reason why this is, by the way, is the same reason why you see people who start looking really bad in politics, which is that when people tell lies, it takes a tremendous amount of cognitive effort for like 99% of people to hold reality in their brain and the lie in their brain and to not mix them up. And so the longer that they tell a really big lie, the more it shows on their face and in their energy and everything like that. It's physically draining. And because of that, at scale, it's very difficult to tell lies that are multiple adjacencies away from reality. Because then the people who are in on what the actual truth is, they themselves get confused about the lies.
This sounds like my son and I are reading 1984, George Orwell's novel, together right now. Of course, the concept of doublethink comes up in that book. The idea of holding contradictions in your mind to ultimately serve whatever the party wants you to serve with those thoughts. And it just seems to me that a lot of people who get paid to tell lies, multiple adjacencies away from reality, are sociopaths. They're people who don't actually feel that stress.
Well, because they actually believe it. So they're called what's called a pathological liar. That's a whole separate topic. But like a normal person who is asked to hold these two things in their brain at once, they will go crazy. And you will see like what happened to that poor woman who used to be the head of the New Zealand government. Just look at the pictures of her from the last 5 years. It is really something else incredible. Right? And it happens a lot with presidents where they age very, very quickly. And it has to do with
Mm-hmm.
holding these two separate realities in mind. Anyway, that was 1 hour. Thank you guys so much
That's awesome.
for today. I think that was an awesome place to leave it off. If you have questions, please reach out to Wolf or I in the meantime. And I'm happy to.
Yeah, follow us both on Twitter if you're not already. Thank you for listening.
Yep, and I'm happy to make the topic for next time something more about like this adjacency thing. By the way, is so helpful when you're dealing with people that have fallen down the QAnon or the Trump derangement syndrome rabbit hole. So
I think that would be an awesome topic for next week if you'd be happy to
yeah,
go there.
I'd love to talk
go
about
down
it
that
more.
down that rabbit hole with you.
All right, thanks guys. Really appreciate it, everybody.